At night, when an enemy detachment crept up to the fortress and the torches by the walls flickered, the stranger from the steps rose to battle alone, drew his bowstring, and the first arrow fell right into the slit in the battlements. The knights stood below and remained silent. He did not wait for them. He did his job calmly and without unnecessary gestures, as if he were defending not someone else's towers, but his own home. I greeted the audience, told them that the story would be about fear, shame, and unexpected loyalty, and asked them to write in the comments where they were watching from. I noted that I was happy to receive any feedback and wished them pleasant listening. The fortress stood on a hill above a swamp. Its stone was warm during the day and damp in the evening. The gate tower smelled of resin and wet ropes. In summer, sacks of grain were always dusted here, and in winter, the guards' fingers froze. The lord of the fortress loved hunting more than councils. He had a daughter who was considered quiet and stubborn in the castle, and a steward who was always exhausted from calculations. Knights wandered nearby, tired and heavy, with copper buckles on their belts, accustomed to tournaments and banquets. When the threat began, they agreed to wait. It seemed wiser to them. The stranger had a short and unusual name. He lived in the stable, closer to the exit, where dry manure crackled and the horses' breathing could be heard. He did not ask for extra bread, did not argue about pay, trained in the backyard, and the boys secretly copied his movements. He was considered dangerous because he was silent and looked straight ahead. He was disliked because he did not drink wine in the great hall and did not laugh at the troubadour's jokes. He was shunned because people believed in foreign omens. When he was assigned to patrol, he would go alone and return with accurate information about the paths in the reeds and the tracks near the distant aspens. The first rumors came from the bazaar in the lower village. The merchants there said that a militia was moving along the western road, and at the recruit campfire they heard talk of an imminent assault. The steward crumpled the orders in his hand and ordered the gates to be reinforced. The knights said that they should wait for reinforcements from their neighbor. That haste was a sign of weakness. The lord nodded. The lord's daughter listened silently and glanced at the map, where the old mill crossing was faintly marked in blue paint. In those days, the stranger visited the women who dried herbs. He was not looking for potions, but for smells, to remember how mud smells and how fresh rags smell, which are usually thrown over siege ladders. He said that smell reveals the approach of danger before the eyes do. No one understood this. They called his laughter strange, although he simply did not laugh. The attack began suddenly, although everyone knew it was coming. During the night, the enemy brought carts with brown straw and rolled them toward the moat. 2 men dozed in the guardhouse on the tower. The third listened to the crackling of the coals. The stranger climbed up to the battlements and saw the narrow flames of torches, like cords stretching along the ground. He struck the stable bell, and the sound faded into the damp air. The knights woke up, but had not yet put on their cuirasses. The lord was looking for his belt in the corridor. The steward clutched the keys to his chest as if they were talismans. On the wall the stranger worked with precision. He placed his arrows and shot in short bursts. Where he couldn't reach, he swung his spear on its loop and dropped it down so that the enemy's leather loop would get caught. The flames near the carts were cut with buckets of water, although the water hissed on the straw like an angry beast. The young squire, whom everyone considered superfluous, brought him bundles of arrows and did not ask if he was tired. He just nodded. The horse below neighed and kicked the stone with its hoof. By dawn, the assault began to subside. The enemy realized that they had failed to take them by surprise, and retreated to the flexible vine by the moat. Then the knights ran out in their helmets and shouted as if they had been fighting all night. Their faces burned with shame, but they hid it with anger. The Lord led everyone to the wall, tapping his heels loudly. The Lord's daughter stood at the embrasure and looked down. She did not smile. She memorized. During the day, hard times began in the fortress. Fieldwork stopped. The mill fell silent. Supplies turned out to be less than the manager had promised. It took longer to draw water from the well because the new winch creaked and tore the rope. The knights demanded more beer so they wouldn't have to think. The Lord walked around the courtyard and examined the ladders tied to the post, almost without meaning, punished the senior guard for missing the carts, but did so without unnecessary words. The stranger asked to put baskets of clay on the walls to fill in the cracks from the impact. The manager gave a tired smile and said there was no clay. Then the stranger waved his hand angrily and went to the moat himself to dig the sticky mass out of the mud, and the boys from the smithy went with him. Towards evening of the same day, a modest cart approached the gate. It was covered with a tarpaulin and carried a long bale. The coachman said that it contained chalk for fishing and new whetstones, which had been ordered for the castle in advance. He said that a merchant from a neighboring town had asked him to deliver it and gave him a note with uneven lines. The manager accepted the cart, although the mention of whetstones was strange because the blacksmith was already sharpening swords on an old wheel. No one argued, because the cart had arrived during the day, in front of everyone, and looked like a normal purchase. So an ordinary thing entered the gate and hid a threat inside. At night, when it was dark and the wind had died down, 3 men emerged from the bale. They smelled of turpentine and salted leather. One knew the layout of the yard, the second moved along the walls, counting his steps, and the third remained by the cart. They wanted to set fire to the grain store and the gate. They relied on the easy trust with which people were accustomed to accepting wheels, sacks, wood chips, and simple notes. Everyday trifles became a gateway to disaster. The stranger, who had not slept all night, stopped at the stable and smelled something unfamiliar. He knew how horses smelled after battle, how resin and exposed wood smelled, and here he smelled a sharp, sour odor that had not been there during the day and realized it was lamp oil. He did not wake everyone because the noise would have caused a panic. He woke the boy squire, told him to bring wet rags, and went to the storeroom. 3 strangers were already stacking bundles of straw by the door. They did not succeed. The stranger threw down the wet tarpaulin, knocked out the sparks, hooked one with the edge of his shield, and struck him, so as not to raise a cry. The boy handed him an iron bar. The 3 were tied up with belts, and the coachman was found under the cart, where he was trembling and whispering that he had been forced to do it. The steward tried to say that he knew nothing, and smeared his hands with clay, as if that would make him innocent. The Lord listened wearily, but decided nothing. The next morning the people below acknowledged that the stranger had saved their bread. The knights said they could have done the same if they had been told in time. The troubadour composed a verse, but no one listened to him. The Lord's daughter called the herbalists and ordered them to check the oil and lamps in all corners. She noticed that the letters in the merchant's note resembled the handwriting of an old scribe who had long since disappeared. She ordered them to be compared, and a boy from the scriptorium opened an old book where the same round curve of letters was repeated in places where taxes were mentioned. That was where a serious thread began. A long siege began. The enemy was in no hurry, setting up palisades at night and rolling out ballistas. During the day, he sent messengers with demands. The neighbor on whom the knights had pinned their hopes was in no hurry. Rumors circulated that he was waiting for the fortress to fall so that he could later negotiate a favorable deal. This caused arrows to whistle during training. And the gray days began to resemble one another. People were losing weight. In the kitchen, arguments broke out over a bowl of porridge. In the dining hall, the lord's daughter sat not by the hearth, but by the window, where she could see the distant rampart and the mill. The stranger undertook to teach those whom no one considered fit to shoot. He put the old carpenter, 2 laundresses, a boy with a burn on his hand, and a quiet girl from the laundry who couldn't speak loudly on the wall. He explained with gestures how to hold a bow, how to look not at the target, but slightly to the side, in order to change the enemy's steps. He showed them how to lay wet wool on a beam to extinguish a fire. He did not say a word more than necessary. With each passing day, his little foursome became more accurate than the knights in their heavy gloves. Hidden talent versus status manifested itself without shouting, without the clang of shields, simply through accuracy and perseverance. Down in the village, people began to say that the stranger might be a mercenary, but his interest was understandable. He lived here. No one hid their resentment toward the knights. They saw it and were angry. The manager tried to redirect the anger toward the stranger, repeating that he was allegedly secretly signaling to the enemy. He whispered this by the beer barrels and in the narrow shadows of the stables. The knight listened. One day, a woman arrived at the fortress with a caravan of flour. She was a merchant's widow, known to everyone from the fairs. She brought flour for 10 days in salt. She told the guards that her husband's debt to the Lord had to be repaid in goods because there were no coins left. They let her in because hunger overcame caution. She entered not as a supplicant, but as a person accustomed to counting sacks and days. Her cart stopped on the bridge, and she went up to the hall. The Lord was tired of listening to talk of debts, and nodded. But the widow opened her accounts, placed a receipt with the seal of the former treasurer on the table, and simply turned the conversation to specific numbers, to the measure of grain and the length of terms. No one expected her to intervene so decisively. She transferred part of the flour to the fortress granary, part directly to the laundresses and the blacksmith, and ordered that the children be given crumbs. She turned chaos into order with a single decision, and stayed overnight in the courtyard near the carts. The unexpected benefactor came without weapons or pomp. By evening of the same day, the Lord's daughter called the stranger to the armory. It smelled of iron and grease. She took out an old map where the mill crossing was drawn too evenly. She said she had heard from an old nurse a story about a baby found at the crossing during a year of great plague. The nurse said that the baby had a pattern on his shoulders, like a mark burned by the sun through a wicker basket. The Lord's daughter said that the stranger had a similar mark on his shoulder. She didn't ask, she compared. He was silent. He remembered fragments of his childhood, where there was cold and reeds, a wooden jug, and the hands of a woman he did not call his mother. He did not make a fairy tale out of it. He realized that once upon a time he had been overlooked here, just as an extra straw on a cart is overlooked. A hidden kinship was formed, not by blood, but by an old deed. Once upon a time he was not taken into the house. He was saved, but given to the road. And now, many years later, he had returned to these walls as a mercenary. She did not ask him to pretend that he was one of their kind. She said that this knowledge was needed not for the title, but for clarity. If you approach the crossing at night, you can sneak into the enemy camp and burn their supplies. This requires a person who knows the swamp trails better than anyone else. He nodded. He did not proclaim it a feat. He simply prepared ropes, wood chips, and fat, and called his boy and girl from the laundry room, because they were quiet and knew how to do exactly what was needed without fuss. They set out at dusk. A dry wind blew down, and the reeds trembled. The trail led to an old bridge which had been covered with slime over the years. They chose each step carefully. The girl carried a jug of water, the boy carried bundles of dry branches, and the stranger carried a bag of resin and 3 short torches. Water murmured below, and a duck quacked somewhere. They reached the enemy's warehouse, which was guarded by 2 sentries. The wind was blowing in the right direction. The sentries stood closer to the path than to the door. The girl dropped the jug, and water spilled noisily onto the grass. The guards turned around. The stranger threw the bundle into the straw and set it on fire, which immediately caught on the grease. The boy hit the barrel with a crowbar, and the oil began to flow. In a minute, the flames became wider and higher than human shoulders. They left as quietly as they had come. Behind them, unfamiliar voices shouted and metal clanged. In the fortress, they saw a column of smoke as if the day had dawned. The enemy moved the battering ram and began to save the provisions, and the night became their enemy. The stranger, the boy, and the girl returned to the gate and knocked in a prearranged rhythm. The guards opened the gate and bowed for the first time without being ordered to do so. At that moment, the castle ceased to be just a stone structure and became a common cause, where simple work was more important than loud speeches. The knights did not know what to say. They stood with their swords, but their swords did not participate. At dawn, the merchant's widow loaded up her cart and left, leaving a receipt in which the lord was now indebted not with money but with his word of honor. She told the guards that she would return if she saw smoke not from a fire, but from bread ovens. Her business was done, but her deed remained as a measure. On the same day, the lord's daughter ordered that the children downstairs be given warm soup. The quiet girl from the laundry suddenly became the person to whom people came for advice on how to save water and how to dry linen so that it would not smolder from sparks. Her hidden talent continued to work when the shouting subsided. A strange silence lasted for several days. The enemy regrouped, dug a tunnel under the wall, and a dull tapping sound could be heard coming from the ground. They dug slowly, sifting through the wet earth. Inside the fortress, people avoided the cisterns because they were afraid of poison. The steward suggested closing the kitchen to preserve the grain, and then a murmur arose. The lord struck the table with his staff, but did not achieve peace. Then the lord's daughter went to the stable and ordered the stallions to be released in the evening to graze at the far rampart. She knew that the ground was softer there. By morning their hooves had fallen into the same void that the enemies had dug. It became clear where the tunnel was. The stranger suggested flooding the passage. To do this, they had to block the old mill dam. It was a risk. The water could recede, or it could cover the tunnel and drown the enemy diggers. He set off with 2 peasants. In the evening they lifted the bolt, The water flowed into the lowlands, and at night cries were heard under the wall. The ground subsided, and one edge of the outer moat turned into a swamp. The enemy retreated, leaving nail marks in the log. The knight said that this was all well and good, of course, but too much honor for simple people. The next morning they went outside the wall for a short sortie and returned in disarray because they stumbled on the fresh swamp they themselves had created, and it became a laughing-stock. Seeing his influence waning, the steward decided to regain his power through curses and fears. He began to whisper that the stranger was involved with herbalists, that he had no faith, that his wounds healed too quickly. He brought emaciated people to the Lord, who confirmed everything he told them because they wanted more bread. He tried to break the bond around which a common cause had already formed. On the same day, a bundle with a letter and a piece of roasted meat was brought from the tavern below. The letter was unsealed. It said that if the side gate was opened at night, everything would end peacefully in the morning. It was another simple object, ordinary food, which became a message of danger. The Lord wanted to throw the letter into the fire, but the Lord's daughter said that such things could not be ignored. She ordered the gate to be reinforced with an additional beam and a triple guard to be posted at the wall. During the night, pressure was applied to the gate from the inside. It was one of the guards who had been bribed. He inserted a crowbar into the hinges to remove the pin. A girl from the laundry room, carrying water to the kitchen, saw a shadow and raised the jug above her head, not to strike, but to block the light from the torch. In the darkness, the guard stumbled and dropped the crowbar. The boy squire, walking with her, whistled as the stranger had taught them. People came to the call. The guards were tied up. The next morning, it was cold in the hall because the oaths and ropes cut into their souls. The Lord wanted to execute the guards, but the Lord's daughter said that the whip would also work. She chose shame over blood because blood would frighten the faithful and provoke enemies through rumors. The guards were flogged and driven into the courtyard. The people saw that weakness did not equal death and began to be more attentive to each other. The stranger slept even less during those days. He sat by the wall and listened to the water trickling from the moat into the cracks in the clay. He remembered the steps, where the wind does not ask for a name. He understood that his past was not connected with the coat of arms on the gate or with songs of victory. His connection was with the people who carved bows from fresh ash wood, repaired troughs, dried wet bandages, and tightened the ropes on the gate. That is why he was not satisfied with the empty sounds from the hall, where the knights were again telling how they had defeated the Taurons in previous years. He went to the yard, where a quiet girl was teaching other washerwomen to line up their buckets in rows, and where a boy was teaching other boys to sharpen iron with the side of a stone so as not to cut their fingers. On the 7th day after the fire, a messenger arrived at the enemy's fortress. He had dusty boots and a fresh bandage on his arm. He told the guards that he was offering a 3-day truce. The manager insisted on accepting because there was little suffering. The Lord was skeptical. The merchant's widow returned just then. She brought with her 2 barrels of fresh water and several sacks, but most importantly, news that the neighbor, on whom the knights had been counting, had spread a rumor that the fortress would fall. She said that the truce was beneficial to the enemy because he was waiting for more carts with reinforcements. Her cold clarity once again became more important than loud words. The truce was rejected. That same night, the knights held a feast, as if victory were already in the bag. They did not drink with the stranger, considering him strange. They mocked the quiet girl because her hands were burned and covered in soap, and called her unworthy. And that same night, it so happened that a new enemy staircase projectile suddenly rattled against the wall, where there was usually no one. A cry rang out. The knights were drunk. The lord's daughter ran out of the hall in her cloak and raised the alarm. The laundresses, the boys, the carpenter, and the merchant's widow, who happened to be holding a rope because she was helping to unload water, climbed up onto the wall. They dragged barrels onto the wall, turned them over, and poured water on the fire. The girl from the laundry, who was considered weak, grabbed a hook and pulled the enemy's ladder up to drop it into the moat inside. She gasped for breath, but she did not let go. The stranger came and put his shoulder next to hers without taking the hook from her. At that moment, no one thought to argue about rank. The underestimated hero became a pillar of strength, and not just one but two, the stranger and the quiet girl. In the morning, the knights looked at the damage and remained silent. Their silence was heavier than their armor. The Lord could not stand the scene. He got up and went to the armory, where the old standard lay. He touched it with his finger and sat down. The Lord's daughter came in and placed the merchant's widow's receipt, a map of the crossing, and an unsealed letter from the tavern on the table. She showed her father 3 ordinary things, paper, cloth, and meat, and said that it was through such simple things that trouble and salvation came. There was no reproach in her words. There was consistency. By noon, dust rose from the northern slope. People in gray cloaks walked in the middle of the field. A man in black rode ahead. The knights tensed, deciding that these were new enemies. The people on the walls stared and held their breath. The merchant's widow raised her hand as if to shield her eyes. She said that it was her husband's brother, who served the neighboring baron, but had come not at the baron's behest, but of his own accord, because the widow had a right to part of the caravan, and a right to demand protection if her goods passed through dangerous territory. She had sent a messenger in advance on her first visit when she saw how they were looking at the walls. She did not boast. She simply worked. An unexpected benefactor appeared for the second time, and now it was not a single decision but a network of connections that she laid out on the board like an abacus. The people in gray cloaks were not an army but 100-strong guard. They could not defeat the enemy in the field, but they could block the road to his camp, knock down the nomadic carts, and burn the bridges that fed him. They turned at the ravine, and the enemy found himself trapped between the water and the dry lowlands. At that moment, the stranger proposed a final step. He said that the enemy could be lured to the swamp by showing a weak spot at the south tower. He suggested placing empty barrels there so that the enemy would think there was a water reserve, and leaving one detachment behind. He sketched a plan with chalk on a board at the smithy. Everyone listened to him. The knights frowned because their remaining role was to cover the retreat of the washerwomen and boys. This was unusual. In the evening, the plan was put into action. Barrels were placed at the south tower, and a carpenter was left there who squinted as if he were frightened. The rest moved to the northwest wall. The enemy saw the apparent weakness and sent people there. They ran across the planking they had laid down themselves. And they fell through because the ground had been dug up and soaked with water from yesterday's work on the dam. Those who jumped over were caught in a net of ropes that the quiet girl and the others had stretched between 2 low posts. They got caught and hesitated. A stranger appeared on the wall, and his arrows again landed where they had stopped. The boy squire handed him arrows without fuss. The merchant's widow below kept people in line, dragged away the wounded, and placed buckets so as not to get in the way. The knights stood at a distance and covered the backs of those they had not considered their equals yesterday. The enemy realized that the trap was simple, but it was too late. Their leader tried to lead his men to the northern slope, but 100 guards in gray cloaks were already standing there. They did not engage in hand-to-hand combat. They simply blocked the path and began to break the carts. The enemy's bags of dried meat were torn open, and their horses began to panic. At that moment, the Lord came out onto the wall for the first time and remained standing there, not looking for a heroic moment for himself. He stood and watched his home hold its ground. He did not need to speak. He understood that this victory was born of hard work and clear minds. By evening, the fire in the field had died down. The enemy had left, abandoning 2 tents and several carts. No one on the wall shouted with joy. Everyone's hands were shaking. Below, the washerwomen set up cauldrons to heat water for the wounded. The blacksmith removed the iron from the people and stacked it in a row to sort through later. The merchant's widow wrote down in a notebook how much flour to give to each person. A boy with a burn on his hand sharpened knives. A girl from the laundry sat on a stone step and held her burned palms on her knees. But she did not cry because she knew that tomorrow would bring other worries. The manager tried to enter the hall first that evening, but an old carpenter blocked his way. He said that today it was the turn of those who had stood on the wall, not those who had counted other people's bread. The Lord placed a chair near the door for the merchant's widow and the people in gray cloaks. He ordered water to be brought and placed a jug in front of the stranger, not as a gesture of mercy, but as a sign of recognition. He announced that from now on, there would be a special place at the low bench by the hearth for those who had previously been overlooked. He did not speak grand words about honor. He made visible the changes that had already taken place. That night, the Lord's daughter took out the old map again and traced a thin line around the crossing where the baby had once been found. She said that knowledge of the past was important, but it should not control the future. She asked the stranger to leave a secret sign at the gate so that everyone who entered with a cart would be checked not by their seal, but by their deeds. The stranger nodded. He went out into the courtyard and saw the boy he had been teaching, telling the others where to line up the buckets and how to hold a bow without pride or trembling. This boy repeated the movements of others, but lived by his own mind. In the morning, simple life returned to the fortress. Bread was baked in the ovens. The mill began to turn again. The sacks were counted in the warehouse. Punishments for misdemeanors became milder, rewards quieter. The knights retrained not in tournaments, but on bridges and ropes. They began to talk not about coats of arms, but about how to quickly hoist a sail in the rain, how to put your shoulder where the banners are not visible. It was hard for them, but not shameful. Every morning the Lord walked around the courtyard and stopped, not at the standard, but at the water barrels. Rumors, as usual, spread around the neighborhood. Some said that miracles had saved the castle. Others said that the widow, with her connections, had helped. Still others said that it was all about traps and swamps. Those who were inside knew that it was all down to small actions. The unsealed letter turned out to be a trap, the cart with sacks a threat. But the water barrels became the salvation. Invisible people became visible. The stranger, who was considered dangerous, turned out to be the one who kept the line. The quiet girl, who was despised, became a role model. The merchant's widow, who was usually referred to simply as a merchant, became the one who knew how to intervene and change the course of events. By mid-autumn, The water had drained from the moat, the grass had died, and the smell of wet earth hung in the air. People began to repair what fear had broken. They put in new beams, smeared cracks with clay, and dried wet mittens on ropes. The Lord's daughter set up a place by the stove where anyone could come and tell what they saw that was disturbing. There, they were not ridiculed. There, they were recorded and verified. There, a hook that had once been used to pull up the enemy's ladder was hung as a reminder that a simple piece of iron could decide the outcome of the day. One early morning, the stranger went out to the crossing. He stood where the baby had once lain. He was not looking for a legend. He understood that his connection to this place did not give him a title. It gave him a duty. He returned to the fortress without further thought. The people at the gate nodded to him, not as a stranger, but as one of their own. He did not smile. He simply took off his quiver and hung it on a hook by the door, knowing that he would pick it up again in the evening. When travelers came to the lower village a week later, they were told a short story. On the night when the enemies were approaching the walls, the knights lost their voice, and the stranger from the steps did not wait. He stood up, drew his bow, and the first arrow fell right into the gap in the wall. Then there were days when ordinary people pulled ropes, turned barrels over, and set traps. Then a widow came, and her determined hands divided bread and fear equally. Then gray cloaks came and blocked the enemy's path. Then a quiet girl did not let go of the hook. Then the Lord stopped looking for a loud pose and stood on the wall, next to those he had not noticed yesterday. Then everyone understood that the fortress was held not by the coat of arms, but by people who knew how to do simple things at the right time. The ending turned out to be simple. There were no miracles in it. There was only a choice. The manager was removed. His place was taken by a man who knew how to count bags, not hide notes. The knights did not lose their swords, but they reconsidered their habit of waiting. The Lord's daughter began to look more broadly at the courtyard and the field. The merchant's widow set up a shop at the gate and agreed on fair prices so as not to wait for handouts. The girl from the laundry became the senior in her trade and taught newcomers how to pour water so that the fire would not go up. The boy with the burn became a gunsmith. The stranger was left without a title, but with a name that was spoken quietly and respectfully. Justice entered the castle, not like thunder, but like order. Everyone received not a reward, but a place where they could be useful. The knights learned that cowardice is cured by action, not by a cup. The Lord understood that power is not a loud speech in a large hall, but a morning tour of the courtyard. The merchant's widow saw that her abacus could stand alongside swords. The girl from the laundry was convinced that her hands, burned and simple, could hold iron when necessary. The stranger was convinced that home was not blood or a seal, but those who stood together by the wall. And so, clarity returned to a city surrounded by a moat and reeds. It was not brought by coats of arms. It was gathered by those whom no one noticed at first. And every time a new cart stopped at the gate and the coachman handed over a note, people looked not at the seal, but at the deed. And every time an arrow rang out at the wall, someone remembered that first night when a stranger became one of their own, not with words, but with a precise shot. Autumn settled into the stone and wood. People stopped counting days. They counted deeds. During this period, an old man in a crooked cart approached the gate. He brought bundles of parchment and several empty leather bags. He told the guard that he was carrying the account books that the former clerk had forgotten. The clerk's name was once spoken with respect, but it disappeared along with the money. The old man asked to be let in because he promised to return the lost records. The Lord's daughter told him not to rush. She ordered the books to be opened right on the bridge, so that every page could be turned with clean hands in the light of day. The parchments contained notes about secret payments and a confession written in a trembling hand. The former clerk had given the keys to the enemy in exchange for a share of the duties, and the manager had helped him. The old man explained that he had been the clerk's assistant and had been afraid to speak out before, but now he had come forward because he had seen that the fortress was held together by equal hands, not seals. His words were relayed to the Lord. The steward bowed his head. The trial took place without fanfare. He was not thrown into a pit, but was taken to the gate and given a bag of breadcrumbs, so that he would leave and not frighten people with his poverty. On that day a new rule was established in the fortress. Every piece of paper, every bag, every bale must pass through the hands of not one person, but 3. There stood the merchant's widow, the boy armorer, and the old carpenter. From this simple table a new habit began. One of the knights, the one who laughed loudest at feasts and was the first to hide behind others' backs, was the son of a man who had once served in a neighboring militia and died at the crossing. He wore a beautiful belt and had an empty gaze. In the days after the victory, he withdrew and stopped coming to the hall. People said he was sick with pride. The Lord's daughter sent him to the mill, not as a punishment, but as a test. He learned to set the pins, pull the ropes, and watch the water push the wheels. At first he was reluctant, but then he began to arrive earlier than the others. One night the water rose higher than usual, and the mill shaft jammed. The knight did not run to the castle. He remembered the carpenter's movements and diverted the pressure to a spare chute. In the morning the flour flowed again. The washerwomen said they hadn't noticed the stoppage, and that was the best praise. The knight stopped avoiding people. He began teaching the boys to hold their shields, not to hide themselves, but to cover those standing next to them. It became easier for him to breathe because his hands had found something to do. The merchant's widow established trade with the villages through short nighttime trips. She agreed with the shepherds that they would lead their flocks along the edges of the fields to soothe the earth and cover the tracks of strangers tunneling. She did not argue about fame. She placed people where they were needed. She was considered strict but grateful. She once asked the Lord for permission to put a small table with prices for grain and salt at the gate. There was no bargaining, just an announcement, so that everyone would understand what they were paying for. Since then, there had been less arguing because the numbers had become a kind of wall that could not be pushed down with shouting. The quiet girl from the laundry room was given the right to keep the key to the fabric warehouse. It was a simple key, but it held entrusted power. She introduced a system for keeping track of pieces of coarse cloth and taught the women to dry it over low fires so that sparks would not catch the edges. She asked that a round stone be placed under each water barrel so that the bucket would stand evenly and not tip over in the hustle and bustle. They listened to her because she showed time and again how a small thing could hold a large one. On the winter street, they bowed to her, not out of fear, but out of respect. Her hands were scarred, but the scars were not a mark of misfortune, but a sign of her mastery of her craft. Once, a stranger found a boy on the outskirts of the village who was throwing pebbles at an old wall and hitting the same crack every time. The boy was the son of the very guard who had been flogged and expelled. People avoided him because they remembered the shame. The stranger took the boy to the backyard and gave him a short bow. He showed him how to hold it and how to breathe. The boy listened with his eyes and shoulders. A month later, he was already hitting a bundle of straw from a distance that adults could not reach. People began to speak less about his parent. They saw that children were not bound by their father's mistakes, if there was someone nearby to teach them new things. Refugees began to flock to the neighborhood. They carried bundles on their backs that contained more memories than belongings. The fortress could not shelter everyone, so they put up shelters on the vacant lot by the old willow tree. The merchant's widow distributed raincoats and coarse cloths. Carpenters assembled shields into benches, and laundresses organized a row of buckets so that dirty water would drain into a pit. Once a day, knights stood at the edge to prevent crowding. The Lord's daughter allocated a small part of the barn for food for those who worked on common tasks. Thus, a circle of labor arose around the fortress, in which a random crowd became an understandable queue. In winter, a new misfortune came in the form of disease. It did not start below, but right in the castle. One of the squires fell ill and began to shiver. People were frightened because there was plenty of work to do, and weakness disrupts order. The stranger remembered the step custom of keeping the air moving. So he threw open the doors of the armory and ordered each room where the sick man lay to be ventilated in turn. The herbalists brought wormwood and cumin. A girl from the laundry explained how to boil bandages in large cauldrons. The merchant's widow insisted that everyone who worked near the sick should receive hot soup and rest in shifts. The disease did not spread. It died out as quickly as it had flared up, because simple measures worked before panic set in. People saw that fear can be touched with your hands, if those hands are clear. In the spring, a man from a distant monastery arrived at the fortress. He brought a seal with an image of a crossing and 2 signs. He said that along with the seal, he carried a record of an old favor. Many years ago, a woman from the fortress gave the monastery part of her grain during a year of plague, asking for only one thing: if a baby was found at the crossing, the monks should send word to the fortress so that the child could one day choose where to live. The inscription was old but clear. The Lord's daughter read it and was not surprised. She told the people that the old favor was being returned not as an obligation, but as an opportunity. The stranger had already chosen this fortress as his home for so many years. No one raised him up on a shield. No one branded him with a coat of arms. He remained in the same courtyard by the stables. But on that day, the boys at training began to call him by his name more often, which now sounded alongside their own names. A neighbor who had been waiting for the castle to fall once sent a messenger with cold words. The note said that the border between the estates needed to be clarified, and the best way to do that was through a joint council. The Lord could have refused, but now he had people who thought more broadly. The merchant's widow suggested bringing specific measures to the council: the number of bridges, the length of the boundary, the right to water during drought. The stranger suggested drawing the line not out of pride, but for the convenience of cart traffic. The girl from the laundry added that there should be a place by the water where any traveler could draw water without entering the yard. The council was held in an open meadow, near a post where horses were usually tied up. There were no feasts there. There was a rope with knots every 20 steps. The neighbor could have bitten the bit, but he saw that it was not a conversation about glory, but a reckoning of deeds. He agreed. The border was marked with stones, not hurtful words. Meanwhile, the knights got used to their new role. They stopped waiting for the trumpets to sound and began to listen to the muffled sounds of the earth. They remembered that a ladder could not only be chopped down, but also pulled. They stopped laughing at women with buckets. They were the first to place barrels in an arc so that the fire would not spread along the wall. One of them, who had previously boasted, became the best at discreetly stretching a rope across the courtyard for nighttime signaling. His boasting disappeared because he saw how quiet work changed the outcome. He himself told the boys that a coat of arms looks good on a cloak, but is meaningless on an empty head. By summer, a new bell was hung in the tower. It was not rung unnecessarily. It sounded rarely, and therefore confidently. At the bottom of the gate, a bench was placed for the elderly who knew the old days. They were asked to tell not legends, but what was useful in the household when the water rose, when the wind broke the roofs, when the fog covered the paths. These stories became lessons for those who yesterday only carried water. The fortress slowly became a place where memory was stored not in the songs of one troubadour, but in the habits of many hands. On a hot day, a dusty column danced in the distant field. These were people from the south. They were not enemies. They dragged carts and children behind them. They had heard that there was a place on the hill where habits were stronger than fear. They were greeted not with a feast, but with water and a list of tasks. They were shown where to dig a new ditch to drain rainwater, where to bring stones to reinforce the path, where to place the carts so as not to block the view to the south. They were not offended. They had come not for mercy, but for order. They were included in the bread queue. The gate became more crowded, but not noisier. The Lord's daughter said through the elders that every newcomer would be given a task on their first day, so that they would not have time to turn into fear. This rule proved to be stronger than the fence. Sometimes at night a stranger would stand on the wall and look into the darkness where once the fires of strangers had burned. He remembered the day when he rose alone and the day when a quiet girl stood beside him and pulled the hook. He understood that he was not the only one who saved the fortress. He was the first who did not wait. Then others appeared who did not wait for their turn for glory and simply did what was necessary. These small steps formed a path that now leads across the entire courtyard. Past the bench of the elders, past the table with prices, past the barrels with round stones, past the place where the hook hangs on a rope, and next to it, a neat bundle of arrows. People walk this path every day without asking loud questions. They know that the house is held together by precise movements, and every time someone tries to enter the gate with an unstamped note, they are met not with shouting or blows, but with a check devised and approved by those who were previously bypassed. Thus, simple justice has taken root in the struts of the gate, and each new day only strengthens it.